All right. As folks are rolling in, I just wanted to say welcome to the Buzz with BCLB. This webinar is held in collaboration with the Rock Center for Corporate Governance at Stanford University. We are very thankful for this partnership and hope to see a lot more collaboration. Without further ado, I will be very excited to introduce our new topic. Is ESG linked? Executive pay driving real change? This is a question, at least on my mind. I'm sure on a lot of people's minds. I don't want to get in the way of this juicy conversation, but before we do jump in, a couple of reminders as folks are rolling in. We will be dropping a link in the chat for you to sign up for CLE. So keep a lookout for that. It'll be hopefully soon, midway through the conversation and towards the end. We'll also link our website. This is where we will be sharing whatever webinars we have coming up next. So stay plugged in. And then if you're having any questions, you have any concerns, please email us at bclb.law.berkeley.edu. There is a Q&A feature available on this webinar. Please do feel free to ask your questions. The conversation will be ongoing. There will be a moment for you, for our speakers to actually answer some of those questions. And then that's basically the logistics of today's call. My name is Anjali Patel. I'm the Executive Director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Business, and it is so good to see so many of you again. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Bobby Bartlett of the Stanford Rock Center for Corporate Governance.
Thanks, Anjali, and thanks everyone for being here today. I thought I'd just start off by sort of providing just a brief overview of some research that Adam and I had conducted on this question of ESG. And as economically minded legal scholars, we naturally sort of come at this from an incentives perspective and thinking, well, if we really want companies to pursue an ESG agenda, or if one wants companies to pursue an ESG agenda, then the place to look would be in what incentives are being provided to those managers who control the corporate affairs. So there had been some research on whether or not ESG compensation existed. It's sort of a binary, like were companies incorporating more ESG metrics into their executive compensation plans. But there hadn't been any research that looked at really what metrics are being used, and more importantly, were those metrics actually being set in a way that was likely to advance a company's ESG agenda, or were they being set in a fashion that were maybe intended to be achieved? Naturally, as a policy matter, if you want a company to have strong incentives, you want to set the target in a fashion that is difficult but not impossible to achieve. And so we should see some variation. Some companies miss, some companies meet them. And that was really the empirical question that we set out to ask. And so we did so by looking last proxy season at the S&P 500 companies in terms of how did they utilize, if any, ESG-linked compensation. And so I'm going to turn over to Adam, who will provide some highlights from the paper.
Thanks, Bobby. Hi, everyone. I'm Adam Badawi. I'm a law professor at UC Berkeley and teach in the business law program. So I'm going to walk through a very small number of slides from the paper. So let me go ahead and pull those up. And so here's the title of the paper that's out there. If you want to Google it, find it on SSRN. There's been some other coverage of it. But I'll just give you a brief overview of our findings. As I do that, I'll go over some kind of basics of executive compensation. If you work in this area, this is going to be stuff that you know well, but if you're new to it, you might not know these particulars. And so you usually see three components in executive compensation: a salary, an annual bonus, and then some sort of long-term incentive that's made up of restricted stock units or stock options or some mix of those. And so what we did in our, as part of our sample, which was in the 2023 proxy season, we figured out what the percentages were for each of those. And you can see that most of it is in the long-term incentive compensation. It's 10% salary, 18% bonus, and 72% long-term. For the attempts to link compensation to ESG goals, that has largely been done through the annual bonus, right? And the existing research that was out there established that fact, right? And so what that means is that it's a relatively small, so it's usually only part of the annual bonus, and the bonus is relatively small. So that means that overall, this is not a huge part of the compensation. And how the annual bonus works is that there's a bunch of different targets for different sorts of areas. So there's financial targets, and there might be things like revenue and EBITDA targets. And then for ESG components, you might have a safety component and a DEI component. And all of these things are going to be the elements that add up to your ultimate bonus. And within each of those components, you will have a kind of minimum level that you need to hit in order to receive any amount of compensation for the bonus. You can have a target, at which point you'll get 100% of whatever has been allocated for that component of the bonus. And then you can have a maximum, which if you hit, you get some percentage more than 100% of whatever that target was. So if you hit 100% of the target, you get 100%. If you exceed it, you might, by 50%, you might get 150%, and so on. Okay, so as Bobby explained, what we do in this paper is we go through the proxy statements and actually figure out, did these targets get hit, and what percentage, and at what threshold? Were you below them? Did you hit the target? Did you hit the maximum or exceed them, and so on? Okay, so in our sample, we find that 63% of the companies in the S&P 500 use some sort of ESG performance measure. The vast majority of those are in the annual bonus. That's 304 out of 315. We're seeing an increasing trend, at least for the time being, of incorporating this into long-term incentive compensation, but that's a relatively limited practice at this point. And so what we find is within the bonus of the firms that use it, it's about 15% of the bonus, right? And recall that the bonus is a relatively small part of the compensation. So this is 3% of the overall potential compensation. So relatively small at this point. Unclear which way that trend is going to go, given kind of some countervailing things that we're seeing out there. But the important part for the purposes of our paper is how often do you hit these targets, right? Where are they being set? And this is, as the title says, our paper in essentially one slide, right? And so on the left, we see the ESG targets, and on the right, we see the financial targets as components of the annual bonus, okay? And so what this shows is that let's take a look first at financial targets. Oops. Of the ones that we see out there, 203 exceed all of their financial targets, okay? 147 of them exceed some components of the bonus, and then miss other parts of it. And then 107 miss every single component of their financial targets, okay? So that gives us a sense of where those are being set. And it looks like they're being set in a way that they're not easy to achieve, right? We see a material number missing all of them. What about on the left-hand side where we look at the ESG targets? Okay, so, and we have a smaller number here, right? Just about every firm is using financial targets, whereas only 63% or so are using the ESG targets, okay? So the raw numbers are not as important as the percentages here, okay? So we see that 97 of them exceeded all of their targets. 67 of them met all of their targets. And then if we look all the way at the right, only 6 of these firms miss every single ESG target. So this is a really strong contrast to this 107 over here. It is, I think it comes out to just a couple of percentage points of the firms miss all of their targets, whereas here it's approaching 20% or so, right? So it looks like they're being set or at least evaluated in a way where you're meeting those targets. And I'm not going to go into the details here, but we do a little bit more analysis to try and figure out, is this related to ESG performance, or is this something that might be a symptom of a governance concern? And we look to see whether or not these firms over here that meet and exceed their targets, does that actually produce an increase in their ESG scores, which can be measured a number of ways. We don't find any evidence for that. And then we see some indications or some relation between these firms that are meeting and exceeding all of these targets and things that are typically associated with not great governance practices, like higher no vote percentages on say on pay. So the upshot of what we find is that just about everyone meets their ESG targets. We sometimes say it looks like this might be a participation trophy. And so that's what we found. And I think what we'll do next is give Drew and Mark an opportunity to react to those findings.
Well, this is Mark, and I'm a dreaded compensation consultant responsible for all of this. And I'm not surprised. There's a little bit more a quality associated with this. Typically, what you see is that targets are generally set to be reasonable and achievable. But there's a range. And so when you hit all of them, how much are you getting paid? So, for example, a maximum payout on a financial metric is typically 200% of target, and threshold is 50% of target. And what we often see in the design is that there's a lot more volatility in the financial metrics and less volatility in the non-financial. And again, this is a gross generality, but you don't see a 200% payout very typically in an ESG metric because they do tend to be a little bit more binary. You either achieve them or you didn't, or if you can qualitatively evaluate them, again, the range tends to be around the target.
Yeah, and this is Drew Hamway. I head up stewardship at CalPERS. And to echo some of Mark's comments, these results are not surprising to me. As I think, Adam, you pointed out in your slide, these metrics account for 3% of CEO pay. So in the title of what we're talking about here, is this affecting change? It'd be hard to argue that if your incentive structure, 3% of it is toward some kind of ESG change, that's meaningful at all. And so we do find that these tend to be plug or participation targets that are easy to achieve and less rigorous than the financial targets that are in these plans.
One just follow-up question, sort of I mean, in some sense, both of you come at this from two different perspectives, and I guess I'll just ask the question: how should we interpret these results? I mean, do you view them as problematic, or is this like a well-functioning system, and this is just what we should sort of expect going forward? Kind of what interpretation should we put on these findings?
Yeah, I think you need to look at it over a longer period of time. If you're always exceeding, you're always meeting all of them and getting paid at an above target rate, then you have to ask yourself the question, or you don't have to ask yourself the question. It's clear that you've either got a very, very high performing organization, or you're setting your targets too low. And generally speaking, it's probably that you're setting your targets too low. But so we generally say, hey, look, over a 10-year period, you should hit target about half the time, and you should hit zero, as in you didn't hit anything, maybe once, maybe twice in that 10-year period. This is over a cycle, and I recognize that not all companies have cycles, but generally over a long period of time. And then you shouldn't hit max very often either. And so you look to adjust the next year targets to reflect the performance that you've had, and whether or not we believe, we being the board who is setting these targets, believe that what is being presented by management is reasonable and achievable, or they need to push them more. So there's always going to be a little push and pull between management and the board as to, is this a reasonable target or is this a layup?
Mark, something we saw in writing this paper was that there's great variation in the way the compensation plans will evaluate the ESG targets, right? So sometimes there'll be a hard verifiable target, such as, safety as an example. It's you have to report accidents to OSHA. That's something that's relatively easy to measure. For some of the DEI targets, you have to make reports to the EEOC. And so that's something that's relatively easy to measure. Whereas in other cases, we would see, well, the compensation committee would go into a room and evaluate whether or not the executive cares about X component of their ESG bonus, and then decide, well, yes or no, kind of in this very opaque way. They either fell short, met, or exceeded that goal. Could you tell us something about kind of why there is that variation and how it comes to be?
Yeah, and I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth here, so bear with me for just a moment. But when we first started seeing ESG metrics being integrated into incentive plans, it was very much like you described. They went into a room to see whether or not anybody cares. Really, and we saw this. It was, you need to have a plan to do better on, especially around DE&I, as people were trying to get their arms around exactly what are we trying to do and establish some targets. And so it was often a very subjective measure that said, we're going to make progress. Well, what does making progress mean? On the other side is sometimes you don't want to disclose all of this for competitive reasons, or there may be some other reason to not disclose. But you want to make sure still that you've got robust targets. And there should be that's an opinion. Oftentimes you will want to have some judgment exercised by the board. I mean, that's why they're there. And so locking yourself into a single metric with a purely objective measure fails to take into consideration what happens during the year that could have an impact on your ability to achieve that. But objective is better than subjective. Drew, I'm sure you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, and I think a part of this, Mark, was investors were grappling with in 2019, 2020, this push into more ESG, and the obvious place to go was, well, if you're comped on it, you're going to care about it and do something about it. To use a tangible example, I remember talking to a particular company who in their corporate social responsibility report was at 22% women in their workforce. And they say by 2025, I think this was in 2022, by 2025, we want to be up to 25% women in our workforce. And I said, well, if that's something you're shooting for, maybe that should be 15 or 20% of your LTI, because you've already stated a clear goal. It's fairly easy to measure, and you've got 3 years to get there. They didn't take me up on that, but that would be an example of, something that would be easy to verify, a target that you had already put on your back, but hadn't worked into the compensation plan. I said, well, if you don't get there, there should be some, punishment or haircut for, not achieving that goal. So part of it was investor problem, just saying, hey, do something on ESG and these comp plans, and, that'll make everything all better. And we didn't give clear advice on what we're actually looking for. So, we put some of the blame on ourselves.
And Drew, can you weigh in on the sort of proper way to interpret these results? I take Mark's interpretation is that, at least for an individual firm, you kind of want to look at these things over time, and if you're persistently sort of above target, then that suggests you're setting these too low. In some sense, we took a different approach and looked at the cross section and kind of found sort of within the cross section, it seems as if they're showing evidence of that. But how do you interpret this paper?
Yeah, I think in looking at some of the conclusions in your paper, I would lean more toward, to me, this is a signal of weak governance by comp committees, in terms of if if you always get there, if everybody gets the participation trophy, then it's not much of an incentive. So at an individual company, there could be some variation here, but your results suggest that boards rushed into this. They didn't think it through very well, and that it appears that that portion of the remuneration plan is almost always met. I think the slide said 6 out of the ones you looked at, did not meet the goal or disclosed didn't meet the goal, which to me suggests that we have some weaker governance than we would like as investors over the scope of this cohort that you looked at.
And why is it that companies seem, even putting aside whether they're meeting or missing the target and the difficulty of the target, why so much focus on the annual incentive plan? Like Drew, to your point, I mean, it seems like if you really want to sort of create incentives, you should tie it to the long-term incentive plan where so much more money is at stake.
So
Mark,
there's a structural problem in putting non-financial metrics in long-term incentive plans, and it's an accounting issue that flows through your earnings statement, your income statement. Basically, unless you have very hard and fast metrics at the beginning, at the time of grant, then you could have what we used to call back in the old days variable plan accounting. And basically, it means that the charge for the long-term incentive can vary with the stock price. Now, that's sort of a cop-out because the design that Drew described, which says we are going to move from, I don't remember the number, 22 to 25, is in fact something that would meet that requirement. It is a very hard and fast number. Companies are loath to do that, though, because what they're finding is that many times they're achieving these faster than they thought they were, and then they might fall back. And so they just don't have as much experience with these non-financial. Again, I'm making excuses here, but this is some of the discussion that takes place that we're a little nervous about this. It's not the same as an EPS target that we have to achieve or return on invested capital. And, I don't know how we're going to get there. We don't have a good roadmap.
Do you think the process for how you think about these target, I mean, so we compare financial and non-financial and we see different rates. I suppose we're kind of presupposing that they should be in the same ballpark. Is that right? Is the way compensation committees think about these two sorts of things different, or is it similar?
They think about them a little differently. Number one, they spend a lot more time thinking about the financial metric, because that's the biggest piece of the incentive plan. And they're striving to make sure that they're getting that right. Then they're thinking about the non-financial. And I'm going to, and there's really a difference between the type of business that you're in. And so to the extent that you're cyclical, so let's say you're subject to some sort of commodity pricing. Maybe you're in manufacturing and you see some sort of cycle. What you do is you say, we really are going to have trouble understanding the cycle and being able to pick those targets. So we know that sometimes in an up cycle, we're probably going to get paid more than we should. And in a down cycle, we're going to get paid less than we should because we're going to set those targets too high. And when they think about the non-financial targets, they know that they're always going to get paid somewhere near target, whether a little above or a little below. You just tend to see seldom see zeros and seldom see maximums. And so the way that many people will think about non-financial to include ESG is that it's somewhat of a ballast to the overall incentive plan, so that you're not going to see zeros being paid. You'll see something being paid. And you can see that as you drill down into those ESG, what are we really paying for? Manufacturing, you might have safety. In fact, that's a big metric. In other industries, you won't see any safety at all because it's just not safety is always important, but it's not critical to the strategy. Uh, so again, there's a lot of thought that goes into this. Let me back out one more comment, and that is when this first came about, uh, as Drew mentioned, and we were getting a lot of pressure that we really need to have these metrics in the plan, whether it is a emissions reduction, whether it is a more women in the workforce, or whatever it might be. We didn't know exactly how we wanted to do it, but what we did know is that if we put it in the incentive plan, we were sending a message. Number one, we were sending a message to Drew that we heard you and we're putting it in here. So we're talking to our shareholders. Number two, we're also talking internally. Because remember, I think your data showed how large the ESG metric was as a percent of the total annual incentive. And it's really small. It's relatively small. So when you ask the CEO what she's going to do every day when she wakes up, ESG isn't the first thing she's thinking of. She's thinking about that financial metric. But it is sending a message to her people in her firm that says, look, guys, there's a lot of things that are important, and we've decided that this is one of the ones we're going to pay for. So we need some focus on this.
You know,
Drew, when it
oh,
comes
go
to
ahead, ask your question. Yeah.
Drew, when it comes to these things, do you feel heard?
Well, I seldomly ask for these metrics to begin with. I mean, I use the one example because the company on a call said, "Hey, we're going to do this," and I said, "Well, if you're going to do this, then what happens if you don't get there?" But I was not one that was, pushing hard for these things. I think one other element I'd like to bring into this, in terms of the board and governance, is it can't go unsaid that boards are very nervous that if they don't pay a market rate for their CEO or the CEO, the named people, they're going to get poached. And the time and effort to replace those people is very costly, expensive, and whatnot. And so, making sure that, whatever metrics they're setting are achievable. If we had a regime where all the metrics were zero, which I think would make some investors happy, total no pay for any performance. The boards are cognizant of, hey, if we don't pay whatever the perceived market rate is in some fashion, these people are at risk of leaving, and that's going to put a different pressure on us as board members. So I think that's important to add to this conversation.
Do you ever worry? I guess this question goes to Mark. Do you ever worry, or does the company ever worry that if these ESG or non-financial metrics are acting as ballast in some sense, like they know that they're there, that it's no longer performance-based compensation? I mean, then it starts to sound a little bit more like salary, and then
Yeah, so yes, because we don't want them to be, what's the old word? You trip over the newspapers, you walk out the door. I guess that's not really very good anymore because nobody gets newspapers, but um, you don't want them so simple that you know they're always going to be achieved. They need to be reasonable and achievable, but not a layup. And therein lies the problem. Who is going to say what that is? And are we pushing hard enough to improve? So yes, yes, and no to your question.
The questions come through. I was asking, the participation trophy syndrome seems widespread, and investors recognize that this is a sign of weak governance, yet say on pay votes tend to be high in general. Is this because investors also recognize that no one cares, or are there other reasons? And I guess, Drew, how do you think about sort of clearly there's the investor engagement process where you directly communicate with issuers, but there's also the SAM pay in terms of communicating. Like, how do you view the SAM pay lever?
Yeah, so for example, at CalPERS, we're not afraid to press the no button and vote against. I think in the last 5 or 6 years, our average support for USAM pays has been 40 to 50% against. That said, having not always worked here on the asset owner side, on the manager side, there's still a worry about access to management and reticence to vote against management. I think there's some potential conflicts in that arena. And so, yeah, it's a metric we can easily track on SAM pay, but I think if you took investors aside individually and asked them behind closed doors what they're looking for, they would say, hey, this is a bit of a mess. But we do find that, some of the larger asset managers right now, their support with management has increased dramatically over the last 2 or 3 years across the board, whether it's shareholder resolutions, SAM pay. I think we had the highest support for directors this past year, highest support for SAM pay, lowest support in probably the last 5 years for environmental and social proposals. So I'm not sure it's directly tied to how we feel about pay, but I think there's some other elements going on in voting that have more to do with political risk than with pay for performance.
This is a question that builds off of one of the Q&A questions that just came in, but it takes a step back and says Drew, why do you guys care about ESG, right? And I think it's related to the debate we see should companies just be trying to think about their own company, or should we be thinking about things from a wider portfolio perspective where we need to think about these long-term problems because they will ultimately affect portfolio performance?
Yeah, so we take that portfolio view is we, as an asset owner, plan to hold these assets for, decades is optimal. We're not a day trader. We don't have 100% turnover of our equity portfolio. We want to be active owners, not activist owners. And we all operate in an environment that if it's unstable from an environmental standpoint, that could have serious impact on our returns and our ability to pay pensions. And so we have this conundrum, this collective action problem, where an individual company we're asking to maximize shareholder return. But when we step back, if everybody's just maximizing return and the externalities that come with doing that are detrimental to the overall stability of the marketplace, how do we account for that as shareholders, as share owners, the actual owners? We're trying to take that long-term portfolio view into account, but there are many other participants in this market that are more focused on that short-term return and get paid for that short-term return.
And Mark, how do you experience that on your end, getting input from investors? I imagine some have CalPERS's perspective, but some don't.
Yeah, well, it gets to, as we design incentive plans, what is the organization's strategy and what's important? And as we cascade that strategy into the incentive program, it begs the question of how do we determine what we should pay for? Clearly, we have to pay for financial performance. Otherwise, we're not a sustainable organization from a continuing to operate and pay our own people. But in addition, how are we as a steward of the organization and our environment, whatever that might be, whether we're an oil and gas company or we're a technology company, and they have different expectations around what that means. Generally speaking, and then take it one step further, these things may be very important, but should we be paying for them? And so I think your data said, was it 63% of the S&P 500 had an ESG metric? Is that right?
Yeah.
Somewhere in that neighborhood. But I would suggest, I don't have the exact data, but there's a good 15 to 20% of organizations that in their annual incentive have nothing but financial metrics. Now, that doesn't mean that emissions are not important to them. It's because they're managing their people, they're managing their organization, but they don't necessarily have to pay for these things. And they will often have, and Drew made a joke in an earlier discussion we had around, there's an inverse relationship between your sustainability report and your actual performance. I haven't tried to test that. But we do find organizations that do not have ESG metrics really caring about ESG metrics. They don't have them in their incentive plans. So that's part of how we think about that it doesn't have to be Are you only going to get good ESG performance if you have it in the incentive plan? No, you're going to get good ESG performance if it's important to the board and important to the management team that they prioritize it. Incentive plans are one way of supporting supporting that. But I would suggest that the vast majority of executives don't do things because they'll get paid in their incentive plan. It's the concept of being coin operated. We always run across coin operated people. Yeah, I'm sure everybody knows somebody. It tends to be people who work on commission. Executives really need to think about the long-term sustainability of their company, because the biggest piece of their compensation is in stock and in equity, and so they want to see the equity move up in order to create value for themselves and their shareholders. So they're aligned there. I went off on a tangent there, so please bring me
No,
back.
no, and Mark, I would just add to that. I think it's equally, if not more important, that boards think that way. The average board tenure is 10 or 11 years. The average CEO tenure is 6 years. And so the board, as representatives to shareholders, really hold the keys here to driving that sort of long-term multiple cycle type thinking, because they tend to be in the seat longer, and that's their responsibility.
Drew, maybe I'll take this time to invite you to either praise or critique the current structure of executive compensation just in general as a way of fostering long-term thinking. Adam mentioned the standardization that you see. It's really remarkable just how much companies stick to this template of, roughly $1 million in salary, and then there's 12% annual incentive plan, and then the bulk and long-term incentive awards, but they're not really long-term. I mean, usually they vest over a 3-year period, and you're doing this each year. So I guess how do you sort of view this current structure? Do you think it's sort of it achieves the long-term thinking you have in mind, or would you start from scratch and design something that looks a little different if you could?
Yeah, I mean, broadly, if I could start from scratch, I would kind of throw out what we've done here. And the reason I say that is when we talk about 3-year ratable vesting, you're really looking at 3 multiple 1-year periods. And that last performance period is just a 1-year goal to hit the overall 3-year goal. Some of the instruments we use can be more geared than other instruments that are out of favor. So PSUs are more in favor today than RSUs. I think in some instances, depending on the type of company, a RSU with a 5-year vesting period, maybe some holding requirements after that, would provide better alignment with long-term holders than current structures. I think I pointed out in an earlier chat, if we think back to Jack Welch, who was the CEO of the 20th Century, we all voted on that. His last full year paycheck, when adjusted for inflation today, would put him at the median pay opportunity for an S&P 500 CEO. So we've had this, going back 25 years now, some real great inflation here, where I think as shareholders, the system that we have come to adopt that tends to be a one size fits all has really, I think, overpaying for beta performance. And so I'm not sure I have all the right answers, and I don't want to blanket this. It would apply to every company, but if the best CEO of the 20th century would only be paid at a median today, I think we've gotten something wrong here.
Mark, do you have any observations on the great inflation and what's behind it?
So I'm responsible for that. Comp consultants and really surveys, because as all the statisticians know, the median increases whenever everybody tries to achieve the median. And so that is part of the reason why compensation just continues to go up and up and up. All boards, not all boards, generally speaking, if you believe you've got a executive team that is performing, you don't want to pay them below the median. And so we see that increase in just the sheer size of the compensation. Drew, I thought you were actually going to talk about a push by some investors a minority right now to, if not eliminate, you mentioned PSUs, and what you meant by that was performance stock units, which is I get a share of stock and I only earn it if I achieve some sort of generally financial performance over a 3-year period, which again is very short. And there's a push to, and some companies do this. Why do we have a 3-year vesting period? Why don't we have a 5-year or a 7-year vesting period? Because then I don't have, I can't get more than the target number. I just get the target. And, if I'm not any good, you're going to fire me in that 5 or 7 year period, and I won't vest in that stock.
Yeah, and if you look at, not to pick on any company, but if we remember back a decade or so, I think it was Tim Cook at Apple, they gave him a 10-year award. You don't earn a single share for the first 5 years, and you don't earn the other half until year 10. And if you got fired at year 4, tough cookies, you were out of luck. Well, yeah, Apple's done pretty well over that 10-year period. And I'm not saying, that's the silver bullet answer to all this. But the complexity, Mark and I think you and I were joking. If you and I have to take out a slide rule to figure out how the CEO is going to get paid, how is the board going to understand that? How is the CEO going to understand how they're getting paid? And I think you're right, Mark. Most CEOs want to get up, do a good job, build a sustainable, lasting business, and that's what we want as investors. We should pay a good rate for that. It shouldn't be overly complex. It shouldn't be overly volatile. And a 12% year increase in the median for the S&P 500 just seems crazy, but that's where we have ended up.
That's related to a question that came in from one of our colleagues over at Haas, kind of suggesting, well, look, there's studies out there saying ESG performance is like you see better ESG performance among the firms that are run better, that perform better. So why don't we just incentivize performance, right? Why don't we get rid of this complexity that people out there have introduced into these systems? Wouldn't we be better off if we just focused on the financial?
Well, and and if I could, I think part of it is we've had some instances in the ecosystem going back to the financial crisis and, 07, 08, 09, where a lot of people got paid for clearly poor performance or, going out of business. And the run-up of pay they got before they went bankrupt really, was horrible for investors and really pissed us off. If you look at, once again, not to pick on a company, but Boeing has had to now fill the CEO seat for a third time in the last couple of years, and the two outgoing CEOs collectively are getting over $100 million of, go away payouts. Well, that stock was, when they made that decision was down more than half. And so when we see these pay for failures, we were trying to adjust it in such a way that we put in these metrics to try to say, hey, if you don't hit these metrics, you're not going to get something, because there were some people getting way more than they deserve for utter failure. And so we created this regime and we thought that was going to solve the problem. But as Mark pointed out, if most of the metrics are achievable and then a little above achievable, you get above target and we get the great inflation. And so in our zest is, shareholders to try to tamp this down a little bit for, overpaying for utter failure. We've created this system that has created this great inflation that I don't think is helpful, and wish we could start over, but I'm not sure if we do, we're going to get it right the next time.
Can I ask a question that's sort of on this, more on the financial metric side of things? So one innovation in the last several years has been the increasing reliance on peer groups as a way to try to fine tune who's performing and who's not. And so just as background, so that for the audience, so the idea would be that if we're gonna have a long-term incentive award, it could be based on your stock price, but that stock price is going to be affected by things that have more to do with, say, the industry or the market than anything that the executive does. And so what we'll do instead is we'll basically create a peer group of companies, and then you're going to be graded about whether or not your stock price is above, say, the median or the 75th percentile of that peer group. So it sounds nice in principle, but in practice, it raises the obvious concern that we're going to cherry pick our peers to basically be, all of the companies that we expect to sort of outcompete, just by virtue of their poor management, not because of ours, say. How do we police against that type of cherry picking?
So I've picked a lot of those, and one way to do it is to use an index. But you also have to be careful because everybody thinks they are unique. Everybody thinks they're one of a kind, and nobody else is similar to them. When you use an index with a broad enough group, you can police some of that. I would suggest most people don't go around cherry picking. Rather, they look at organizations they think are similar. And what we're seeing over time is that you just can't outperform that group all the time because as you look over the cycle, somebody is going to catch up to you. The other pushback is, and this I think is good pushback, is currently most plan designs pay target for median performance. And they pay if you're above the 75th, you hit maximum. If you're below the 25th percentile of that peer group in relative TSR performance, you get 0. Well, why should you get target for achieving median? Shouldn't it be something higher than that? Maybe the 55th percentile or the 60th percentile? And we're beginning to see that movement. It hasn't gotten there yet, but we're beginning to see that.
Yeah, I think I said earlier, we feel like we're paying for beta here.
Yeah.
And if the median goes up every year faster than the rate of return, then we're definitely overpaying for beta.
So turning to the future, we did this study in 2023, which is not even this past proxy season. The prior proxy season, part of it is the incredible difficulty it is to actually collect these data, which in some sense may say something about why it's hard to monitor it in real time anyway. But I guess one question would be, do you think we've hit the high watermark of ESG metrics? And if so, do you think that results in companies not caring about it, or that they'll just pivot to caring about it in a different, maybe more opaque fashion?
Yeah, so let me kick this off and let Drew weigh in. I think we've hit peak DE&I, and that's because of the Supreme Court case last year and some political pushback. And so a lot of boards are saying to themselves, why should I put a target on my back, disclose this as how we pay people, and then risk a lawsuit that I'm discriminating against the majority? Rather, and I spent a lot of time in boardrooms talking about these issues, and everyone believes that it's appropriate for their company, the population within their company, to reflect the communities that they serve, their customers. They really do care about this. But putting in the incentive plan, I think we will see that decline. So we saw that in the plans we designed for 2024 that will be reported next year in the proxies for 25. We will not see a decrease in carbon, in sustainability. We won't see a decline in safety. Those are continuing to be important and things that can be measured. So maybe not peak ESG, but definitely peak DE&I occurred in 23.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing there's some influencers out there. I don't want to give them too much airtime that don't own any shares that have some companies running absolutely scared. It's very short-term thinking in our view. So we think the vocal commitments will completely go away, especially on the DEI issue. Doesn't mean they're giving up on it, but they're just at least in the interim. Now, is this 12 months, 18 months, 48 months, or I can't predict how long this hushing is going to go on for, but it's definitely going to go on through 2025.
Just out of curiosity, I mean, is this mostly just uh, kind of grievances aired by a select few that doesn't actually impact the bottom line, or companies, because the channel by which I think companies worry is in part through their customers turning away. Is there any evidence that that's actually the case? We don't really have the counterfactual world where none of this happened, but is this something where boards really do feel like it's impacting their bottom line, or is it mostly they don't like the PR?
Well, I think a couple of examples, and I don't have all the data in front of me. I mean, Anheuser-Busch ran into a bit of an issue with um, advertising, and there was some backlash against that, which I think hurt some short-term sales and profitability. I don't know if that's returned. Target felt some pressure um, on some of their LGBTQ initiatives in some of the products, and received some at least initial backlash. And so I don't know if that has abated for some of them. So there has been some examples where in the short term there has been some sales and margin issues at a small number of companies through this sort of boycott um, influencer campaign. Once again, um, one of the people, and I'll pick on Kid Rock. Don't know him, not a huge fan of the music. He was one of the people in the Bud Light example that was a big fan of Bud Light, and then said, "Oh my God, I'm never going to drink Bud Light again." And within 2 weeks, there's pictures of him at his concerts drinking Bud Light. So I think it was more to do about nothing, but that kind of PR, I think, has scared some folks.
Yeah, I do believe it's PR, but I don't want to suggest that it's just the DE&I stuff, because we also see activists get involved, and these are activists that own very, very few shares, try and get votes onto proxies with things that there's a lot of gadflies out there that bring up the same thing to all companies. They buy one share and they try and get something proxy access, basically. And some of these things are ideas that we might think are positive, such as why aren't you spending more time on carbon and carbon reduction? Uh, but it isn't necessarily the best way to get their attention, because it's not engaging in a conversation. It is simply trying to get access and make a big deal out of it. Now, some people may argue that that's the right way to get things done, but it tends not to be popular in the boardroom.
Yeah, and Mark, I need not to dovetail too far away from the comp discussion there. Over the last few years, there have been certainly some activist-minded folks that have used the shareholder proposal process in a way that I don't think is particularly helpful. That said, I don't want to throw the process out, baby, with the bathwater, because there's been great strides in corporate governance made through that process in the United States. We're in this little bit of a weird era right now where maybe 20 to 30% of these proposals, the person is just looking for a platform at the meeting, and that's their entree in. That's not particularly helpful, but some of the pushback, which I think boards would like to do away with the whole process, I don't think would be. I think the pendulum swinging too far that way wouldn't be helpful either.
But let me share one thing though, and it relates to ESG specifically. And as I mentioned before, a number of companies back in 19, whenever we started doing this, uh, put these very subjective metrics in place. And there was pushback from folks like Drew that said, "Hey guys, wait a minute here. This is not real. This is the participation trophy, because you're not going to tell me what you're going to do, and then you're just going to say that it is okay." So pushback in the right way from investors can really have an impact on how boards think about incentive plans. And I believe if you look now, you will see far fewer just tell me that you've done something and I'll pay you. And more, you've got to have a robust objective. And maybe we'll use a little objectivity, excuse me, we'll use a little judgment because you did or you didn't achieve that. But we have a real number, we've set it out, and we're striving to achieve that.
Yeah, and Mark, what we said to every company is whatever metrics you use, they need to be as rigorous as all the other metrics you're using.
Mark, do you have a sense of how that's played out? So that trend sounds like it's, I don't know if that was this year or last year, but insofar as this year you saw the realization of last year's ESG targets, if they were harder, did you see that they were not being met as often?
No, I can't say that that's the case.
So it roughly consistent with what we found with the year prior.
Yeah, so let's talk about carbon just for a second. I realize we're getting towards the end, but what we had a number of I'm aware of a number of companies that set emissions targets that they did not know how they were going to achieve. And this is a gross generality, but the less engineering focused they were, the less likely it is that they knew how they were going to get there. Conversely, and I work a lot in the chemical industry, those folks already know how to deal with emissions other than carbon. So they could take those same engineers and go after the carbon emissions and say, give me a roadmap of how we're actually going to get this achieved. And that's a target we know how we're going to get to. Those folks were far more successful than the others who set a target because they thought it looked good.
You know, there's the famous example of Starbucks that said, and this is back in 17 or 18, they're going to reduce cups by 25% in over 5 years. At the end of the day, I don't think reduced it by more than a percentage. And so I asked them, I said, well, you know, what happened? They said, well, 25% sounded like a nice round number. So once again, if it's not rigorous, you're not going to get where you need to be.
Yeah, and Mark's example suggests too that it's you have to have a plan. I mean, it's this that's really critical, and it sounds like that's not always the case.
It's not always the case, and with the changes to the accounting and the rigor that is going to go behind, especially what's going on in Europe right now, we are going to see better accounting and better ability to understand what our emissions really are. Because it's not just somebody, in the back room with a, piece of paper writing something down. There are real systems that can be audited, and that's really the key. And not all companies are up to speed on that yet. They're trying really hard because they know this is coming, but the robustness of the accounting matters.
And how much of this is a measurement problem? Like take emission, there's a lot of different ways you can measure emissions. There's some standards that are merging, but the SEC is hung up on their version of the rule. Is that something that also varies from company to company in terms of how well they know how to measure the thing that they want?
Certainly, it's a maturity issue. How mature are their processes in order to capture this information?
I think we are almost at the hour. I guess, Drew, do you want to leave it to you to sort of provide the parting observation on the state of ESG-linked executive compensation?
Yeah, I hope I didn't leave everyone with the impression that we should throw our hands up in the air and give up because nothing seems to work here. But if investors are engaged and thinking long term and working with the companies they own, we can get to some reasonable outcomes here. But it really relies on that communication between the board, their representatives, and the share owners to really think long term about this. And if we do that, whatever metrics are used, can be helpful in driving value for share owners.
Well, thank you so much, Drew, Adam, Mark, Bobby. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you, everyone who joined this call. The link to the CLE and our website is in the chat. Please do sign that up now before you exit in order to claim credit. But with that, I just want to say a virtual round of applause for all of our participants and for our speakers. Thank you so much for your time, and we hope to have you again. Bye-bye.